Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Cathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakari Chapman
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America. Welcome to Constitutional Chats. I'm Janine Turner. I am founder and co-president of Constituting America. We are a nonprofit. We've been in existence for 10 years now, almost 10 and a half. And we teach about the importance of the founding documents and the United States Constitution is included in that, of course, in the Declaration of Independence. In many, many ways, we have a contest. We have a 90-day study. We have a George Washington speaking initiative where we speak into your classroom all over. So we're thrilled with this. And now we have Constitutional Chats, which has been launched during the coronavirus. So the co-president of Constituting America is my dear friend, Cathy Gillespie. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Cathy Gillespie. She's co-president of Constituting America and one of 16 private citizens serving on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, helping organize the celebration of our country's 250th birthday in 2026. And Tova love say hi, Cathy.
Hi, everybody. We're glad that you're here.
And I always like to say that in order to fly, you need a left wing and a right wing. And so without Cathy, I would just be flapping my wings, not my one wing, not getting off the ground with all these ideas.
That is not true.
So is. Okay. And Tova Love Kaplan. Tova Love Kaplan is just the brilliant, brilliant young woman. She is 16 years old and lives in Chicago, Illinois. She currently serves as Constituting America's National Youth Director. And she runs the National Youth Advisory Council. And I like to brag on her and say that she runs it like equally as like a CEO of a major Fortune 500 company or better. She just does a marvelous job. She's a 3-time winner of our We the Future contest. She won in a middle school for entrepreneurial category where she created a marketing plan. How many middle school students do you know who are creating marketing plans? And this, I think as a freshman in high school, she won PSA, which is Know Your Rights, Read the Constitution, which she wrote, directed, starred, edited, everything. And this past year she won for STEM, where she created an app for Constituting America, which we will have up shortly. She's passionate about educating and empowering young people to use their constitutional rights. She is a rising junior, and of course she made straight A's in all of her classes in a very difficult, challenging school, I might add. Tova Love Kaplan, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Janine, as always, and welcome everybody, and I can't wait to get into this super important topic.
Yes, yes, and I like to brag on Tova and Dakari because they're 16, 17 years old respectively, but we talked to them about what kind of shows we want to do and how to promote it. They ask their own questions and do their own research. So next is Dakari Chapman, and Dakari Chapman is also brilliant as well. Dakari Chapman is our Constituting America student ambassador. He's 17 years old and is currently a junior full-time college student in South Carolina. He has won Constituting America's We the Future contest twice. The first time he won for PSA, where he reminds viewers the Constitution is an American thing, so know it, which I did a seminar this week, and they watched his PSA, and afterwards they said, we like what Dakari says. It's an American thing, so know it. And he's also won for a short film that he wrote and produced and starred in and edited, just like he did for his PSA, Man on the Street. He's also actively involved in our National Youth Advisory Board, which Tova chairs. And he's a working actor, seen most recently in HBO's The Righteous Gemstones and in Netflix's Outer Banks. Dakari wishes to be an actor, but also a politician, but he says, really, you need to be an actor to be a politician. Welcome, Dakari Chapman.
Hello, everyone, and we're so glad you're here. I know it's 9 o'clock and my voice is like, hello, but guess what? We're having a good time. And thank you for joining our Juneteenth celebration, and we hope you enjoy it.
Yes, very, very wonderful show we have tonight. Okay, our special guest, as we said, we're talking about Juneteenth tonight, and our special guest is Horace Cooper, our dear friend Horace Cooper. Horace Cooper is a senior fellow with the National Center for Public Policy Research, co-chairman of the Project 21 National Advisory Board, and a legal commentator. Horace averages over 400 talk radio appearances per year, well, representing the National Center and Project 21, in addition to regular television appearances and interviews by the television and print media. I'm sure you've seen him on TV a million times. I have. He's always so wonderful. Horace taught constitutional law at George Mason University in Virginia and was a senior counsel to U.S. House Majority Leader Dick Armey. Horace was Constituting America's first 90-day study, our 90-day study Constituting America director in 2010. It was about the Federalist Papers. All these are online, by the way. And he is a member of Constituting America's leadership and advisory boards. And also, he has written over 30 essays for our 90-day studies. We've done 9 so far. And he is a longtime friend to all of us at Constituting America. It's a real special event tonight that we were able to book Horace Cooper because he's so busy. So Horace Cooper, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much. It's always great to have an opportunity to work with this organization. It's just super important that we find ways to make it clear to the generations that are going to be responsible for maintaining our society, maintaining our government, that they are aware of the robust and wonderful history that we have and what Constituting America does to make sure that the Constitution of the United States is relevant. It's just amazing and important, and I'm just glad to be able to play a role.
Well, what will we do without you? You're our go-to man. You really are. Let's ask Horace. We're always saying that. Let's ask Horace. Okay, Horace Cooper, you want to give us a little history on Juneteenth? Okay.
So as most of the listeners, if not everyone knows, yesterday was the Juneteenth or June 19th anniversary, which represented what happened when in Galveston, Texas, the generals came in and announced to the public, in this case to the actual slave population, that in fact not only had the war come to an end, but that the Emancipation Proclamation was a reality. A lot of Americans actually don't know this, but when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he did so in 1862, and what he did was say to all of the states that were in rebellion, what people now think of as the Confederacy, that they no longer authorized to keep people held as slaves. And all of those who were slaves were in fact informed as a result of that declaration. But on the other hand, there were border states that were not in rebellion, Delaware and Kentucky, in which this Emancipation Proclamation actually had no effect. It was only intended as a mechanism for eliminating the ability of those in rebellion to maintain these individual human beings that were actual, as our constitutional system contemplated. We were all created equal. And it took actually the 13th Amendment, which happened in 1865, that it took that action as part of the efforts in December to end up freeing all Americans who happen to have been formerly slaves, regardless of whether or not they lived in the southern parts or whether they lived in the northern parts. It was December 6, 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified. So the Juneteenth celebration is all about what happened when Army General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston and announced, as part of the effort of the Emancipation Proclamation, to deliver the news. So many people are wondering what caused this celebration to come about. Well, in Texas, the result of the conclusion of the Civil War, which happened in April of 1865, wasn't understood, wasn't realized. And when the news that General Granger brought forward ultimately was realized, it resulted in a really remarkable consequence on the part of all of these Texas slaves. A lot of people don't know this, but some 47 states all across America continue to this day to honor and acknowledge the Juneteenth celebration. But the genesis in most of those jurisdictions, the genesis is former Texas slaves moved to places like California, moved to places like Louisiana, moved to Virginia, moved to New York, and they brought with them these annual celebrations. This annual celebration resulted in more and more people becoming aware of it. Texas, in the 1970s, announced that they would honor the holiday formally, and in the 1980s, Texas actually made it an official holiday in which employees were allowed to take off. So I am a child of Texas. I was born and raised here, and my entire life, I always knew about Juneteenth, and it was always a fun day to get together with family and friends. And we watched occasionally, there was a parade in Houston that acknowledged it. It was something that I always knew of and was always very, very familiar with. When I left Texas and I moved to Washington, imagine my surprise, to Washington, D.C., imagine my surprise to see that there were other people who weren't from Texas who were also celebrating this particular date. The 13th Amendment, which, as I said, happened in December of 1865, formalized this idea that our country was founded on, and that is that all of our citizens are equal before the law. Prior to that, in some jurisdictions, based on your race, but even if you weren't black, you could still be denied citizenship. There were indentured servants who were also white. There were indentured servants who were Asian. Even some people who were members of tribes ended up becoming indentured servants. But our constitutional system was developed on the most novel idea, nothing seen since the days of the ancient Greeks. And that was that we, instead of having the power in the king or the queen or the royal family or lineage, or instead of having the power in the hands of a military force, instead of having the power in a few micro elites, the power rested with the citizen. And we have, over the time of the existence of our Constitution, made sure that we lived up as much as we could and as fast as we could to our original idea. Citizens get to decide who and what policies, who will run them, and what policies will be adopted. So it's really, really great to have Juneteenth, which is a marking of an event where we recognize our founding principle and we made it manifest. And I'll stop there, and then if we want to discuss this some more, I'm happy to do so with any questions that people might have.
That was remarkable. Thank you. That was terrific. Okay, so to recap, and then I'm going to have Tova ask a question. Tell me the year this was read again.
Sure. It was 1865 in June.
Yeah. Well, I know it's June. 18, so it's 1865.
Yeah.
And the
and it
war
was
ended
after. Yeah, the war ended in April of 1865. But the Emancipation Proclamation was issued 2 years earlier, more than 2 years earlier, and it was during the Civil War that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. As I said, it was directed to those individuals who were being held as slaves in the jurisdictions that were in open rebellion.
And the 13th Amendment was ratified on December 6th of what year?
That's 1865.
1865. Okay. So technically, the 13th Amendment had not been ratified by June.
That's correct.
1860.
That's right.
And
That's right. So the Emancipation Proclamation was only an edict directed to any jurisdiction that was either in rebellion or had been in rebellion.
Okay. Thank you. I understand that now. That's great. Okay. So Tova, would you like to ask a question?
Sure, thank you. This is such an such an important and interesting holiday, and I've heard a lot of people refer to it as America's second Independence Day or our other Independence Day, because for a lot of people it's like as significant as 1776. So also, as you mentioned, in a lot of states it is honored as a major holiday, and I've heard of a lot of efforts to make that a national holiday of Juneteenth, where people can take off and have celebrations kind of that are equivalent in a way to our own to the more national 4th of July celebration. So I was wondering, what do you think? Do you think it should become a national holiday? And do you see that happening sometimes in the near future?
So right now, Texas, Virginia, New York, and Pennsylvania have it as an official holiday in which workers are no longer required to either come into office, or if they wish to work on that day, they can take another day off. But it's an official paid holiday. The other 43 states, they have an announcement. Quite a few do parades, like California and Washington, D.C. Senator Cornyn of Texas has introduced a bill, and I predict that we're very, very likely to see action taken on it. His bill would, in fact, make a federal holiday an official holiday out of June 19th, and it is very, very likely, it's rapidly getting a number of co-sponsors, and I would just be shocked if that passes the Senate, that isn't immediately taken up by the House of Representatives. So I think I would, if I were a person making predictions, I think we're likely to see a national holiday for June 19th.
Thank you, sir, for being here. This has been very fascinating. So I'm just kind of, piecing together some of the things you said, and you mentioned that Juneteenth, it came out of Texas, and then it, kind of spread to all the other different states, New York and, places like that. So my question is, a lot of people have never heard of Juneteenth. And you hear a lot of false information about Juneteenth on social media and, places like that. But, you said that, if I remember correctly, you said that 2 months after this, 2 months after the Civil War, was over, April, Juneteenth came into effect, correct?
That is correct.
So that
So Juneteenth,
shows, go ahead.
yeah. Well, I was going to say Juneteenth commemorates the date when General Granger actually read the Emancipation Proclamation that had already been in effect and read it out loud and declared it to be law. And
Right.
that was honored starting immediately the next year, 1866. Texas had its first Juneteenth celebration day.
Right. That's fascinating. Like I said, that's a quick turnaround. So my question to you is, that's always my thing. My question to you is this: why are we not seeing Juneteenth taught in public schools? You know, I never learned about Juneteenth unless on my own hand. I don't believe Tova learned about Juneteenth in school. I know many people who didn't learn about Juneteenth in school. I'm sure it's taught in Texas because that's just the Texas way. So can you riddle me that?
So I guess I would say I was taught all about the Alamo. And even though I see that as a major historical event, it's not necessarily something that every single public school presents. Here's what I can tell you. If, as I predict, that we see this as a national holiday, you're going to see more and more attention being paid to it. The original beginnings of it, starting in 1866, was church and community organization based. So a large number of churches would choose that particular date and they would hold festivals. There was an effort in the early part of the 20th century where in Houston, a number of community members put together their funds and bought what became a park, and they used that park to celebrate Juneteenth. A similar event happened in Los Angeles. My point about it is that it hadn't been so much formalized where we were seeing the kinds of declarations like Governor Ralph Northam of Virginia just this month issued a declaration for June 19th and announced that workers would be allowed to be paid if they wish to celebrate it with their family and friends. It sort of increases in support, maybe ebbs a little bit in support, increases in support. If, as I predict, Senator Cornyn is ultimately successful, I imagine that, like with all other of our federal holidays, some attention is going to be given to it, and that's a good thing.
Yes. Okay, Cathy.
Well, Horace, thank you so much for being with us tonight. This is just fascinating. I was curious, were there other locales, I guess it took a long time for this word to travel to? You said, I think the 13th Amendment was ratified in December of
1865.
1865. Yep. And
yes.
So 6 months later, word traveled to Galveston, Texas. Do you know if other locations received the word sooner, or did it take? Was Galveston one of the last places, or were there places that even it took longer than that to travel to?
So Galveston was the last place. Now, I want everyone to understand, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued formally in 1863. And that meant that there were jurisdictions that were near Washington, D.C., that became aware of this news. And the further away you got from Washington, D.C., the more difficult it was for that news to become realized. You had a second function. If the President of the United States says in the middle of the Civil War, here is my declaration or my edict or my proclamation, as he called it, what could you do to force rebellious states to cooperate? So the irony about all of this is, even after the war had formally come to a conclusion in April, there were still places that had not yet been made aware that this proclamation went into effect. So the proclamation is announced in 1863. Those jurisdictions closest to became aware of it, but you still didn't have compliance until you actually had a conclusion of the war. But as jurisdictions became aware that their side was not going to succeed, in some instances, there were just open uprisings among those who had been held as slaves, who simply said, I know this proclamation applies, and I don't have to be in this status. What happened that made Juneteenth so unique was well after the conclusion of the war, they ended up being the very last jurisdiction to get the news and to ultimately free those individuals. Now, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, Delaware and Kentucky were never in rebellion. And so the proclamation did not apply to them, and it required the 13th Amendment in order for those slaves held in those states for them to no longer be held as slaves.
Okay.
Okay, so yes, and Cathy, I believe you, the 13th Amendment was ratified 6 months after Juneteenth. So if right, okay. So the 13th Amendment wasn't passed until, ratified until December 6th, I can remember that because it was my birthday, of 1865. So this is really about the end of the war. Did they know the war was over? Because it's really about the Emancipation Proclamation being read to them and saying, this is legitimate for you now. You know, this applies to you. This was the last area to actually hear of it. So I think we're all understanding this now. But did they know the war was over, or does that go hand in hand?
So that's what General Granger came to do. Many of the rebellious governments, and Texas was one of those, but many of those rebellious governments had to issue a surrender, and any of the prominent members of the rebellion, if you were in the military, if you were part of the legislature, or if you were a governor in a jurisdiction, you forfeited that opportunity to take that leadership role on. And so it was incumbent upon the Union armies to set up a working government in lieu of the rebellious government. You simply don't say, hey, you guys lost, now, hey, are you going to cooperate? All of the folks who were party to the rebellion were essentially told, you no longer may operate as the lawful government. You were in rebellion, you acted in an unconstitutional fashion, and so when the general came, the general would have acted temporarily with the powers of governor to set up a new government in the state of Texas.
Yes, okay, becoming very, very crystal clear. Tova.
Okay, yeah, this is just the more fascinating and more fascinating as it goes on. This is a really important discussion to have, and thank you for coming on and having it with us. I was wondering, one thing that's really fascinating is that it started as a local Texas holiday, and then as people living in Texas or former slaves living in Texas moved to other areas, it expanded out, and I just find that so interesting. And I was wondering what traditions, you know, how do people commemorate this day? Like, are there any specific traditions that are, you know, standard to celebrate this holiday with? And also I was wondering, has it spread to any other countries? Like, is this a very American holiday, or do people in other countries maybe celebrate it as a way to, you know, celebrate human rights and I guess Black rights?
Well, it's interesting. So let me start with, I am not actually a historian, I'm a constitutional scholar. But it's interesting to note that there were slaves that left America, and in the countries that they went to, Mexico in particular, that you still see on June 19th a celebration there in Mexico of people who were descendants of slaves, and when they realized that they were no longer threatened if they were to ever return, even if you didn't return, under the laws in many of the jurisdictions that held slaves, people could be hired to go and capture you and bring you back. So even if you left America, you weren't necessarily guaranteed that your status as a slave couldn't continue. So it's interesting that you see that kind of thing. There were a number of groups, as I said, starting in 1866, church organizations started the celebrations, and many of the parishioners of those churches, when they migrated to the north, much of that happened in the late 1890s and the early 1900s. There was a huge migration from the south to the north. Our industrial sector began to be made more manifest, and a number of Black Americans took advantage of that. There was a huge push shortly after the Depression, and even during, but shortly after the Depression, to go west. So you saw some Southerners, particularly from Texas, go to California. But you see the same attitude and behavior and acknowledgement of Juneteenth, even as parts of the Midwest, like in Detroit. So at the time, they would do like a rodeo, they would do a parade, there were spiritual songs spiritual hymns is what I'm trying to say. There were spiritual hymns that they would share, and almost always, there would be a reading of the actual Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah, that's wonderful to have that heritage of reading the Emancipation Proclamation. I wonder if that's that would be great to continue to do that. That's just like, we should read the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, which we're supposed to be doing. Dakare.
Yes, Mr. Cooper, you were just knowledge, spewing knowledge, nothing but knowledge, and I love it. So my next question is this. So we see that, there's a constant divide in our government today on a lot of different things and a lot of different levels. And my question is, do you think that with Juneteenth, with all the Juneteenth legislation that is being passed to make it a national holiday, and just the awareness that has been brought to Juneteenth during this time, do you feel like we will see more of a unification due to this legislation and due to the awareness brought to this holiday during this time?
So let me start with saying I hope so. I want to remind everyone what I said at the beginning. Our system, our government, was created off of just a really, really remarkable and unique in time concept, and that is citizens holding the power. And the thing that I think is so super, super important, if the citizens actually hold the power, it should be incumbent upon each and every one of us, and that's why I work really and am enthusiastic about Constituting America. It's incumbent upon each and every one of us to talk to our neighbor, our citizen neighbor, and share our perspective and persuade. You see, King George, before America was founded, he occasionally was saddled by a parliament that really was based on a parliament made up of landowners, some property owners, some wealthy people, many of whom were in fact part of the royal family. He had a negotiated arrangement, which meant ultimately he still had the power. It was not this idea that the parliament had the power. Well, America, it's not that Congress has the power. It's not that the president has the power. America's concept is the citizen has the power. And if we believe that we've kept who can be a citizen in too narrow a constraint, it's the job of the one citizen to try to persuade the other citizen. And the beauty of what I see with the Emancipation Proclamation and then the 13th Amendment is that we recognize that there was this group of people that were welcomed to their citizen status. The thing that I think is so disunifying is this tendency to say that our system is somehow fatally flawed, that somehow it is crippled, it is immoral, and that we would want to, quote, start all over again. Our experiment is the only one of its kind. And it's the only one that genuinely has worked to protect, provide, and promote the interests of such a super large population. There are people, I've had occasion to go to China, there are people who say, well, if you had 1 billion people, you really couldn't just let the people make the choices. You'd have to have a strong man. Here's the beauty of our system. The American system could have as few as 1 million people. It could have as few as 5 million people. It could have 50 million people, or it could have 500 million people. Our system of letting the citizen be in charge is a system that really, it works regardless of time or circumstance. The only thing is that we must always remember that we should never wrest away the power from the citizen. Whoever we give it to, we run the risk that our rights and our freedoms are going to be infringed. The Declaration of Independence walks us through many of the kinds of infringements that exist. So for me, the unity issue here is we should always want to celebrate the genius of our constitutional system. And the thing that bothers me, that worries me, that creates consternation for me is those that would say this genius concept was wrong, was impure, was immoral. It has housed, it has fed, it has prospered more people throughout time than any other system. And it continues to do so. And it's, I think, incumbent upon us to be cheerleaders, promote our Constitution. And if people hear and understand more about Juneteenth, I am hopeful that they see that our system allowed for the 13th Amendment. Our system allowed for the emancipation. And let me just say this really quick about this war, the Civil War. There is no war that Americans have ever entered into, not during the Revolution all the way to the present, other than the Civil War, where more Americans lost their lives. We paid a price. A dear price was paid with the very lives lost. There's been so much conversation about Confederate statues. There's even a conversation now about military bases. Part of what a country does after a civil war, if it's to be successful, is it tries to operate in a term of reconciliation. So occasionally, instead of saying, you are conquered, you lost, you will never be honored, there will never be a chance for you to operate, you actually operate with an open arm. Guess what? That's what we do with Germany. That's what we do with France. That's what we do with Japan. In fact, the record of America and the success of America has always been our ability, if it comes down to it, yes, we will have to fight. But in the end, we seek reconciliation. And so I've been really troubled by those who say we should never have reconciliation. We should always be angry. We should be having a Nagasaki or Hiroshima Day so as to make sure that people who are Japanese remember the end of this conflict. No, we should always be pursuing reconciliation. America sacrificed a great deal. We have tried and we have succeeded in moving forward. Juneteenth is just part of our history, and it's a new part that I think I mentioned earlier we're likely to hear a lot more about in our schools, but unity is desperately needed because our Constitution really is just too great of an idea or a concept to let it go.
You know, Horace, you just mentioned what I was wanting to ask you, which is about the intention of Abraham Lincoln after the war, which was to not punish but to reconcile. Of course, he was assassinated before he could accomplish this, but the reconciliation, that's a really interesting point that you've made. What would Abraham Lincoln think about how far America has journeyed and what is happening today? I think you just answered that, but I mean, you know, if Abraham
Lincoln, I will tell you this. I think Abraham Lincoln would just be astonished at how well Black America has been treated since this conflict. It hasn't been perfect. It hasn't always been awesome. But today, to live in America as a Black person means that you live better as a Black person than you would anywhere on the planet. There is no other place, not even countries in which Blacks are the majority, where you can have the kind of education, the kind of health access, the kind of opportunities for prosperity that America provides. In fact, if Black America were its own country, it would be one of the dozen most powerful economic countries on the planet. It is something that we don't always talk about, but there are things that we should celebrate. Having a great relationship is important. It means if you're married, everything isn't perfect, every conversation isn't wonderful, but the parties to that relationship work to continue to make it so, to prosper it. And I hear dialogue and conversation in some instances that makes me feel like if I were a marriage counselor, there are some folks that just aren't really interested in reconciling. They don't want to make this work. This experiment, that's what America is, an experiment. It's so critical. You take America out of the global equation and the whole world's history looks remarkably different. And we need to be mindful of that. We need to, kind of embrace this. So I think Abraham Lincoln would really just be thrilled that what ended up in this horrible conflict where more Americans lost their lives has ended up resulting in so much success. And as I said, that doesn't mean that it was a straight, linear direction where everything was perfect at every stage, but neither is every good long-term marriage. There are no real relationships of any substance where you see just a straight upshot. Microsoft has had its ups and downs. General Motors has had its ups and downs. The point about America is it's this concept that's so amazing, and as we spend more time on its amazing concept, what we get to see are all these benefits.
Wonderful. Cathy, I think I've been so mesmerized by Horace. Cathy, I think it's your time to have a question, isn't it?
Well, thank you. And Horace, you've talked a little bit about the 13th Amendment, and I wanted to go back just for a second to the history of the 13th Amendment. Now that I've got my timeline all correct, it looks like to me that it took about a year for the 13th Amendment to be ratified from the time that it was introduced. Is that, how did that go? I mean, was it hard to get it ratified? And what was the process on getting some of the states that have been in rebellion to get them to ratify?
So, couple things. The House of Representatives was able to pass the 13th Amendment at the beginning of the year in 1865. I believe it was January 31st. Part of the reason was that the rules of the House of Representatives allowed those individuals who were not present to not have to be counted for getting your majority necessary to pass a constitutional amendment. But on the other hand, in the United States Senate, it actually did require the at least a number of senators, both from the free states and a few from the states that were not free or that were in rebellion. So one of the things that happened was that, as I mentioned, take Texas, when Governor Granger came in, you would have a military establishment make sure that the government continued its operations, the state continued its responsibilities. And eventually, and by eventually I mean fairly quickly, they would hold elections, and in those elections, if you had not been a supporter of the rebellion, if you had not been an incumbent government official supporting the rebellion, you could run for office. And so in some of these jurisdictions, the lion's share of the population at the time were the former slaves. There were some whites, there were some indentured servants, but many of the citizens had either been disqualified because of their status. So that made it actually fairly easy to get a senator or two elected so that then the Senate could hold a vote. And they were able to get that not only passed, but ratified by all of the states by December 6th. Well, not all of the states, the required number of states, sorry.
Okay. I would like for Tova and Dakari to have a quick last question, and we have 9 minutes. So Tova, you first, but I want to make sure Dakari gets a question too.
Sure. So, you know, usually when we learn about this time in American history where slavery was abolished, we learn it through the three amendments that were passed during that time period: the 13th, which we've discussed, and then the 14th and the 15th. And I was looking up the dates. So for the 14th Amendment wasn't ratified until 1868, and the 15th wasn't ratified until 1870. As a review, the 14th gave citizenship rights to African American people, and the 15th Amendment gave African American men voting rights. So could you briefly talk about how difficult was it to ratify those two following amendments, and why was there a couple-year gap in between each of them?
So there was a big debate both before the Supreme Court, in state legislatures and Congress, as to whether or not the 13th Amendment ended up solving all of the problems that had existed with regard to slavery. And there were those who thought that since you couldn't be held as a slave and you had been born in America, you must already be a citizen. And therefore, there shouldn't be any need for any additional support or action taken in order to make sure that everyone received their rights, even if they were formerly a slave. And there were a number of cases in which the Supreme Court even used the 13th Amendment as the basis for striking down actions that were undertaken by still formerly rebellious governments, but they were now members of the Union, that had as their effect creating this status of inservitude. But ultimately, it was determined that without actual definition, explaining and empowering and overruling any existing law, and that's how the 14th and then the 15th Amendment came about. The 15th Amendment guaranteed that the vote would never be taken from someone just on the basis of either their former status as a slave or because of their race. The 14th Amendment sought to say to any government, even Washington, but any government, that it could no longer draw distinctions between its citizens on the basis of their race, and that all the citizens would therefore be given all of the rights and privileges that any other citizen has been provided. Part of the problem occurred over time as we got further away from the Civil War. Politics got in the way, and there were those who had never supported the Union, but either they weren't disqualified or enough time had passed that they were allowed to enter back into the political cycle. Some of those people made their way to the Supreme Court. Others became governors. Others became senators. And they actively used their role. They actively used their role in these positions to undermine the very meaning of the 14th Amendment. To me, one of the reasons I used to tell my class, it's not a good idea to just say we are going to sit back and let the Supreme Court handle all of the protecting of our rights, all of the protecting of our privileges, all the protections of our immunities. There are many, many instances. We can look at recent, but over time, there are many instances where the Supreme Court didn't get it right. Now, they may ultimately change, but that's incumbent upon us as citizens to persuade our fellow citizens. We need to support free speech. We need to support freedom of assembly. We need to support the Second Amendment. We need to persuade our citizen neighbors of the value of this. And then it is far less likely that you'll see a circumstance where a legislature, either in Washington or in your home state, will ever infringe upon your liberties. More actions on the part of the citizen using their persuasive power means more of our liberties are protected.
Okay, thank you. Last question here. Dakari, I want you to have the last question, and we have 3 minutes.
Yes, ma'am. So my question is relevancy to today. Today we see a lot of statues that are historical that are being taken down now with everything that's going on in our country. And for me personally, you know, there's been a lot of statues that are being taken down that are, you know, of certain Confederacy things or things that are being taken down because, you know, there's just an array of different things that are being taken down. And as an African American myself, I feel like a lot of these statues are, you know, make me even more proud to be African American, and that that our country's come past these things, and you know that I can grow and become better. And my question to you is, how do you think this is going to shift culture, not only Black culture, but you know, the United States culture as a whole? Because we have statues and monuments of, you know, things in our history everywhere. And in my opinion, I'm an African Methodist Episcopal, and if you're going to take down, you know, certain things, then, you know, 9 people were killed in a church by a white supremacist, then we should take that down too. But that is a part of history, and it makes us even, you know, prouder to be Black. So my question to you is, sir, what is your opinion on how this is going to shift culture?
So I think your question is very insightful, and I really am, when I hear you ask the question, I feel hopeful about how our future is going to be handled in the hands of the next couple of generations. We have always got to be mindful that extinguishing or crushing facts that we either don't like or that we disagree with, they hinder us from understanding what actually happened, why it happened, and what we can do or are doing that have made our situation better. We don't need to dwell every day on every problem that we've ever had, but we also should never find ourselves trying to erase the actual existence of any problems, nor should we, in the course of trying to erase problems, find ourselves erasing successes. There have been attacks on statues of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, we really, really ought to be saying, let's not erase, let's embrace, let's talk more, let's discuss more, let's persuade more.
I like that. What did you just say? Not embrace. What did you just say? That was really good. Let's not erase. Let's not erase, but let's embrace. Leave it to Horace Cooper. Horace, and you ended right at 9 o'clock too, man. You were able to encapsulate the last question with a magnificent answer in 45 seconds. What a pro you are.
Well, I just really, really appreciate what you and Cathy are doing and all of the volunteers and all of the participants. This is really, really an amazing organization. And any of you guys are listening or gals are listening and you got your checkbooks handy or your credit cards handy, I really, really would tell you this is a great place to pour in some of your resources because they're doing good work.
Thank you, Horace. Thank you so much. Yeah, we're looking for sponsors for Constitutional Chats. So that would be fun if anybody wants to sponsor chat every Tuesday and every Saturday. So Horace Cooper, truly, you are such a good friend to not only me, but our organization. You're a great, wonderful, just gift to America. And I just cannot thank you enough for spending the past hour with us to explain these great moments in history.
It's my pleasure.